Welcome to this video tutorial developed to support the Word document entitled Excel 2013 Pivot Table Training. This video will demonstrate the section entitled Creating your Pivot Table. The first thing we will need to do is to open the setbox2 file, which we will use for this training. The setbox2 file is a file that is based on a vision report, and it is recommended by Supply Division to use to analyze procurement value over a period of time. The report is based on PO placement data. So once we have the report open, we just activate a cell anywhere in the report and we go to the Insert ribbon. And in the Insert ribbon you will see the pivot table icon, and we will click that. This then launches the pivot table wizard, and it suggests to use the full range of data for the setbox2 report, which is what we need. And it also suggests to open the pivot table in a new worksheet, which is also what is most useful, as it simplifies working with it. It is a more clean way of working with a new pivot table. So we go and click OK, and Excel now launches a new sheet with an empty pivot table and with what is called a field list. So this field list is showing all the column headings from our setbox2 report. We can use these column headings and drag and drop them to any of these field areas here. The first field area is called the filters, and we can, for example, drag and drop the purchasing group to the filters, and that will allow us to pick the purchasing groups that we wish to analyze in our pivot table. So for this training we will use HTC as an example, and HTC, Health and Technology Center, is the 109, 105 and 113 purchasing groups. We will then click OK, and then in our values field let's insert the US dollar value. This field will then summarize the values of our selections. So the value field is always some kind of a data field. It is usually not a text field. So we will now start to build our pivot table, and we will do that by selecting a number of different rows from our setbox2 report, a number of different headings. So what we will do is to insert a material subtype description. We will find it here, and we will just drag and drop it to the filter. And for this purpose we will just select the diagnostic test kits, and we will just start writing the word, and the filter suggests diagnostic test kits, and we click OK. Let us reformat the US dollar value to show a currency. We will go to the Home tab here, to this currency icon, and click United States US dollar values. And just for ease and to simplify, let's remove some of the digits here. So we can see now that for HTC in 2013, the diagnostic test kits has activities for $22.8 million. So let's try and build out our pivot table furthermore. We will do that by adding consignee country name, consignee region name, vendor name, and vendor country name. So let's just expand our filters to look at only the region that is entitled CE/CIS. So consignee region name, CE/CIS, like this. So now our US dollar value drops furthermore because we are now only looking at CE/CIS. So in order for us to actually see which are the countries that are involved in this data set here, we will try and drag and drop some of the filters to the rows section. So first we will take the consignee region name, and we can see that we only looking at one region name. We will then take the vendor name, put below the consignee region name, and instantly we can see that these here are the 14 vendors, and these are the values per vendor that makes up the total of $758,000 worth. We will put in the vendor country name as well. And the pivot table further expands. So let's try and right click anywhere in the pivot table and go to the pivot table options. We will then go to the display option and click classic pivot table layout. This changes the layout and it makes it somewhat more simple to analyze. The placement of the fields in a pivot table makes it different in how you want to analyze the data that you're looking at. So for example, if we try and toggle some of the rows here and we take the vendor country name and move it to the middle like this, then we are looking at still from the top the CE/CIS consignee region name, but then what we want to look at first is the vendor country names, and then afterwards we will look at which vendors are actually in this country. So for India, for example, we will see that there are 3 vendors in this vendor country. Let's try and move the vendor country name to the beginning of the rows datasets. What we can see then is that we have all the vendor country names, the consignee region name, which is the same due to our selection, and then we have the vendor names at the end and the total still. Right now we are only looking at US dollar values in the total fields, but we can actually look at different values at the same time, and what would make sense for us would be to insert the quantities next to the values. So we can go to the pivot table fields here and we can find the quantities and we can insert it in the values field. And what we will see then is the quantities here next to the US dollar value. We can reformat the quantities so that we don't see it as a US dollar value, but as a general number. So right now we can see that for HTC diagnostic test kits in CIS region, there are around 21,000 quantities, and it has a value of 758,000 US dollars. Right now the values is the sums of both the quantities and the US dollar values, but this can actually be changed to show a lot of different ways of looking at the values here. So if we take the quantities, for example, and we click on the arrow here and pick value field settings, we will have an overview of how we can look at our quantities. So we can summarize the value fields by sum, like we do now, or we can count average, we can see the maximum or minimum. We can also show the values as percentages, both of the grand totals, the columns or the rows, or other ways. As an example, let's try to take the percentage of column total for the quantities. So then the quantities changes and we can actually see the proportions of our selection now. So we can see that the biggest proportion is attributed to Shanghai Kehua Bioengineering, which is located in China and accounts for 70% of the total quantities for this column here. Let's try and do the same thing for the US dollar value. So we go here to US dollar value, click the value field settings, show values as percentage of column total, and click OK. Then the proportion is shown for the US dollar value. You can see that for this Shanghai Kehua Bioengineering, the proportion is still large, but it's not as large as the proportion of the quantities. That could mean that some of the quantities here are fairly low cost, which means that the US dollar value is not as proportionally high as the quantity proportion. So let's try and edit our pivot table and clean it up a bit. So what we can do is that we can go and only look at the consignee region name. And then let's try and select all the regions so that we can see the proportion of the quantities and of the US dollar value for all the regions here. And what we can see is that for both the quantities and the US dollar value, that Israel is the country that has the largest amount of activities in 2013 for diagnostic test kits in HTC. We can now try and add one more criteria, and that could be the consignee countries. So we can take the consignee country name and put it under the consignee region name, and then we are quickly able to see which countries has activities in these regions here and their proportions of the grand total column value. So this whole concept of adding or subtracting and filtering the data is basically what it's all about when we're looking at pivot tables. It is able to show us instantly a summarize of the criteria that we wish to analyze. So this is the end of the section creating your pivot table, and the next section will be the additional features, and another video will be recorded for that purpose. Thank you.